So let's talk a little bit about signatures. In the last release or two, we added in the ability to do signatures inline, meaning that as you click a workflow button, you can pop up a signature request. The same thing with an add-in button. You can make an add-in button that pops up a signature request. So I'll start with the easy one first. We'll go to add-ins. I'm going to make a new one. Signature test. Okay. I'm going to put a signature in a record. So I'm specifically going to say, show this as a record add-in in the invoices record type. And I'm not going to do any actions. I'm just going to go to request signature. And I'll say, yes, turn on prompt to request signature. Now, the first thing you'll notice, it's going to ask you what field name to save that signature into. What happens when the signature is captured is the image is actually converted into a text string. It's called base 64 encoding. So we encode the image into a base 64 string and we put it into the record somewhere. You just have to tell us where to put it. After that, you can use it in merge forms and e-forms, things like that. So I'll just call it signature. I'll use the same language, signature test. I'll put it in a field called signature test. Then you can prompt what kind of title, how do you want to ask them for the signature? I usually do something just, please sign here. Right? And then you can give them some instructions. You need to sign in order to whatever, blah, blah, blah. Now, if you want to stamp any text onto the image, you can do that as well. For instance, you could put a date time stamp on it. So I could say, put in date time. And then ask me, where do I want to place it? I'll put it on the bottom right. I'll make it red. And I'll just leave the fonts alone. Okay. So now when I go to any invoice, because I'm telling it to go to the AP invoices in the record add-ins, I should be able to go to the add-ins panel and I'll see one called signature test. Do I have I'll put a nice, there we go, pencil icon on it. So let me start a new tab. I will go to AP invoices. Just pull one up here. Go to add-ins. Signature test down here at the bottom. That's the last one I added. And it asks you for a signature. Boom, boom. Accept. Now, it's not going to show up anywhere here. All we did was stuff it into the actual record field. So if I look at the raw data and I look for the signature test field, oh, hang on, let me do this. Header data only, another new feature. Okay, signature test, there it is. This is what the base 64 looks like. It'll start with data : image / PNG : base 64. So that's the signature right there. It's a big long string. Now, let's say I wanted to show that in an e-form or something like that. Let's go back here. We'll create a quick e-form. And I'll just throw an image in there because we don't want them to sign it here. I just want to show the image. I'll throw it here. Okay, and I will call this. I'll do this. Image URL is going to be signature test. It's not going to show anything here, but let me save that. Oh, got to give it a name. Signature view. Show that in invoices. Save. Go to our forms. Signature view. There you go. There's my signature with my date time on it. So all I had to do was put that bracket. Remember the brackets, those things will pull data out of the current record. And we have a field in the current record called signature test. Because it's formatted as an image, that base 64 image can actually load into just a regular image into an e-form. So now you could actually have an e-form. You would probably only show this field if that signature test is not blank. So you might put a little if then on it to hide and show the field. But here you can just show the signature, make a process that's inline and then show the signature at the end, either in the e-form or whatever else. A lot of times we don't put them in e-forms like this. It's nice to show you. A lot of times we'll actually use a merge form and we'll make that the image in the merge form. So just have them sign it here. And then in that actions, the next action, maybe in that add-in, we would take that image data and merge it into a document. So that by the time that add-in refreshes the screen, that document's in there and they see their image right in front of them. The other thing we can do, since we have the image test field, we could define a field called image test. We'll make it an image field. This is a version 4 thing called image test. Let me move this up here so we can see it. I'll go back to that invoice record. Notice that that image shows up here because that image fields actually show inline. If I control click that, I can zoom in a little bit too. So you can actually use it here as well. And if I do my search for invoices, refresh my screen. There's my signatures test field. I could see them in line. So I could actually see all the records that have been signed right here. The workflow version of that is almost identical. The only difference is you're doing it as in a button click rather than in an add-in click. So if you have a workflow step, let's just add a new one here. Signature prompt. Okay. And I'll activate that as signature test is blank. Okay, assign it to me. Add a button. Call it sign and continue. Don't need any actions really, although I could. But then the prompting section over here, now we have a prompt tab, prompt for signature. Same basic setup. Sign here. So if I go back to that record and route it now, you know what? I forgot to put it in the right spot. Hang on. Well, it looks like it's in the right spot. Oh, this one, that's right, because this one already has a signature in it. Let's go to a different one. Sorry about that. Can't go to the same one. It's already been signed. Let's pick it on a different one. Workflow. It's already routed, but that's okay. There you go, signature prompt. So I'll just go ahead and route that. Okay, so somebody gets in, they do their work, they have the sign and continue button. Workflow asks you for your signature, it accepts, it takes it, saves it, and then completes the workflow step. Moves on to the next step, whatever it is. So in workflow then, you would kind of do the same thing. Maybe after the prompt on this button, it prompts first, and then it runs the action. So after the prompting is done, then you can run an action to do a merge document maybe. That'll merge that signature right into a letter or something like that. So that could be your internal sign-off. It just gets burned into a document, and there's your proof of signature or whatever. The one nice new thing we added in the last release, we didn't do much fanfare about it, but we've already got people who found it and they're using it. If you go to your system options, under security, there's a toggle now called personal signatures. If you turn that on, you can actually save your signature so you don't have to keep signing it every time. You can just click a button to use your saved signature. And if you didn't notice that add-in, I still have that available or not. Yeah. Over here, there's a little use my signature button. That'll only show up if you have a signature on file in the system. So what you would do is you would go out here. Once you turn that on, then everybody will have this set signature option. You come up here and you save it. I'm horrible writing with a mouse. There you go. Okay. What that does is it creates a specific stamp of type signature in the stamps collection that's only for the user who put it in there. You can't even change who gets access to it. You can delete it if you want to, but you can't change it. So this is a signature for admin. So now anytime I go to sign, I hit use my signature. If I didn't have a signature on file, I would not see that button. So we're trying to make it just so much simpler to use these signatures inline now, treating it like a stamp. And I'm not even sure, you know what, that stamp might even show up in the viewer as well. I might have to check a look at that. Let's see, where's the stamps? Yeah, there it is. So I can actually use it in my viewer as well if I wanted to. Well, I'm the only one who can see it because it's tied to my account.
Is there a button for that on eForms?
Yes, on eForms, same thing. I think I might even have one here. Oh, not that one. Let's go. Well, I'll just make a new one real quick here. So yeah, we just added that in the last release that just came out. I'll just pick on one of these. There we go. So if we take one of those signature pads, and it only works on the signature pad, not the topaz or the combo, but just the signature pad one. If you'll notice, there's an extra little green button here next to the clear, and you have an option over here to allow for personal signatures. So if you don't want them to use your personal signatures in uniform, just turn it off. If you turn it on, then they can, but once again, they'll only see that button. It'll look just like this. In other words, if they don't have a personal signature on file, it'll look like it always did. They won't even know the difference. So now if I save that, pull it open, now I'm in an e-form, I can do the same thing. So now if you want to make this offline, now by offline, we mean people who are logged into the system, who can log in, authenticate, but they're going to go offline, not have internet access. So what you can do is you can tag in the where to show, if it's available on the toolbar, because it has to be one that's kind of in the general library, you can say make it available offline. Then I save that. Now, this is a weird name. I just use weird names when I'm testing, but this is the one where I can fill it offline. Notice it's saying form is offline. So I could literally disconnect my internet right now, and I could still fill this in. 3, blah, 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 blah. Save for local, for later, do another one. Save for later, and it queues them all up in the ready to save. And when I come back online, I can go pull them up, review them, and hit save, but I can't do it until I'm online. So now I go back online, open this up. I should probably go back to one I just filled in. And it saved the system, and then it saves it as if it was just filled in. All we're really doing is, if you're in the offline mode, you can just take this browser with you just like this, and it won't, as long as you don't leave this screen, it'll stay here, and you can work it as long as you want to. Okay. But it just, every time you pull up a new one from the library, it adds it to the ready to save. You can go back and edit the saved ones, right? You can do all sorts of stuff with them while you're offline. Then you get online, and then you can save them in the system. Now, we don't have a save all to system option yet, because there's too many things that could potentially go wrong per form. All the data validation doesn't happen until you save it, and we'd have to stop on every form for data. It's not impossible, but it's just cumbersome, so we'll get to that point eventually. But for now, you just have to open them up and then hit the save button to get them into the system. So basically, before you leave on your route, if let's say you're working with delivery drivers, just have them come in here and load up their library. While they're out there, they can pull up a receipt for a customer, whatever. And then they say, yep, when I get back to the office, you'll get your receipt. And when they save it back in the system, the workflow then can, of course, route that receipt back to the customer, whatever. You can even collect customer signatures off while you're out there. That still works offline. The only things that don't work offline would be the autocomplete fields, because it can't get to the data source anymore. File uploads. So if you're trying to attach a document, we can't store that document for submission later. We're going to look at ways to possibly do that. So for now, autocompletes won't work, autocomplete fields, and then the file uploads. So let's say we want to make an entry screen for invoices, but we don't like this entry screen. Too much stuff. Maybe I want to hide the due date for people who are not in a certain team, or I want to do some kind of defaulting or hiding and showing of fields dynamically. That's all possible in eForms. So all we needed to do was allow you to build your form and then tell you how to associate it with your record type. So that becomes your entry screen. So what we did was, let's see, I'll just go ahead and throw a few of these fields in here. That's kind of silly. Those are line item fields. I'll leave those for later. PO number. Let's go ahead and put due date in there. Amount, invoice date, invoice number. We'll do that. Okay. All right. So I'm even going to get rid of this, because when you're in an entry screen, that big graphic at the top takes up too much space. So I'm just going to save this. Make sure, what did I call it? I'm going to change this to invoice entry, just to give it a name. Record types, make sure it's associated with the record type. Where to show isn't super important. I can turn all these off really and still use it so people don't see it in the normal forms library. But when you go to your record type, then go to that record type, And up in here, and there's an entry screen option in general settings that defaults to standard, but now I can say use that e-form for my entry. Okay, we refreshed my list. So now if I do a search, it'll look just like normal. It's a search. But when I go to enter, now that's my e-form. And if I go to pick up one of these invoices, and I'm inside the invoice and I hit entry, edit, once again, my e-form loads up. So it really does replace your entry screen. So now if you think about everything you can do with your e-forms, okay, I can actually put in line items too. So where's my invoices? Line items table here. What else could I do just to make this fun? Let's do this. So let's say show PO number. I'm going to say only show that visible when the amount is greater than 100, just for fun. So now, look at that, it's greater than 100. If I get it down to 99, it doesn't show. If I go up one, notice that?
Nice.
So now you can play with your entry screen and make it more customizable. Like I said, there's times when you want to give certain people the rights to entry, but you don't want them to see all the fields, or you don't want them to be able to change certain fields. Now you got your e-form that allows you to control everything. Make things disabled based on the teams they're in, hide and show based on the workflow step you're in, because it'll still see the workflow step that the record's in, all that. So, and you could do signatures in here, document uploads, all sorts of stuff right in the entry screen.
Brad, on that table that you've done for line items, I'm assuming that we could change as far as like if somebody wanted description to be a lot wider and somebody wanted quantity to be a lot thinner so they could read more of the description, you can do that. Oh, yeah.
Yep. There you go.
Just nailed that.
All right, let's talk about the new e-form designer. If you've been using the V3 one, the V4 one should look very familiar, albeit different. You know, it's basically laid out the same way. We didn't want to shock too many people. It's got the same basic flow to it. Pages down here, controls up here, fields. And then over here, all the properties or whatever selected. But we have added in little things here and there, such as the ability to, you know, oops, I deleted that field. Let's undo that. So now we have an undo feature up here. That came out in the last version. One thing we're adding in the next coming version is these quick options that allow you to switch, like where you're showing the record and whether to route or not, kind of with a drop down instead of always having to go back here, go here, do that. Just do it all from up here. If we look through, I think the record types are all pretty much the same as they used to be, nothing major there. Input fields should be about the same. I'm just trying to think if there's anything really major differently on these. Linked fields. That's one thing that we've always had in the record type. We've added the ability to define a brand new linked field just for an e-form. And in the data settings, you could specify where to link it to. So let's link that to vendors, whether it accepts unmatched or not. Starts with ends with type matching. But you can define the whole thing here instead of having to add it as a field. Because there's sometimes when you just want to quick look up, you don't want to have to make it a field. Now you can do it. Plus, if you have one that's defined at the record type level, you could take that and drop it on there and then tweak it over here and make changes to it if you wanted to. Without having to always go back to the record type, make your changes and redrop the field on the form. That's what you had to do in version 3. Now you can tweak it all here in the editor. The button control has taken on a new life as well. Let me get rid of some of this stuff, clean it up a little bit. Buttons now. If you look at what they can do, let me go back to the default settings. You can set a field value. So let's say that we have text field here. I want to set that, set field value. I want to set text box to ABC with a click, right? So now save that. Click the button, ABC. So you can have buttons that set defaults, things of that nature if you want to. You can perform an action, which would be like a save, cancel, reset, or print, or save for later if you're on the offline mode. So now you don't have to use our buttons. I noticed on the form properties here, if I go to buttons, If I turn off all the buttons, so now there's no buttons at all, I could just use this for my save. And maybe I just put save here and you can pick the save icon.
So that means we can put a save button anywhere we want.
Anywhere you want. You can align it, drop it in a container.
Make it a different color.
Exactly. And one thing we're actually adding in this next release, this isn't available yet out there, is fill. So whatever size the container is, it'll fill the whole container. So you can make it really stand out. If we do that, and let's set our background color to like green or something. There you go. It'll stand out a little bit more. The other things we can do with the button, run a search. You can actually specify a search ID in here. Let's say I've got a saved search called AP Invoices with Chart. I can say run that search. So now if I load that form, hit the button, it actually runs a search for me. You can also do copy to clipboard, where you can have text over here and you can say, when I click this button, I want to copy, text box 1 or whatever it is, take the value and copy to the clipboard, and then run an action set. Okay, so just like the dynamic form stuff we've been adding in, the buttons can now run their own action sets. So I can say, run this and send in the text box 1, whatever, whatever fields I want to do, last name, whatever's in the form itself, it'll send those into the action set. You can perform actions, and then whatever returns can come back, and you can use that to update the field values if you want to on the form. So you could give people a button on an e-form that takes them to their own, you can open up a new window and take them to their own portals, their own internal systems, whatever. You can have a button that they click that goes and calls doc management to do some updates. Maybe the workflow can call a REST API of their system to update their purchase order number based on the number in your e-form. There's all sorts of things you can do because you can pass data now into the system, into the server, and run actions. So this is just another way of doing it. Now you can have a button somewhere on the screen that just does stuff. You can kind of start making a dashboard, really, if you think about it. You can have buttons that open up things. You can have buttons that perform actions. You can show information on the screen that's pulled. When you load, you can actually run an action set that pulls data into it that shows how many invoices they have to process. Give them a button that actually runs the search that shows them their invoices so they can work them. And to that end, we're adding in the ability to do charts. So now I can say chart.AP invoices. And then when they click the button, I want to run the search for the AP invoices. So you do that. So now if I refresh, I get this nice little chart, shows me, oh, there's the invoices. If I click here, it runs the report for me so I can work them. I can also make it so click to search is enabled on the chart. So maybe I don't need the button. If I click on one of these wedges, I'll see just the ones that match that wedge. And I can open in a new tab so I don't have to keep going back all the time. So it pops a new tab each time. So I want to see those invoices. There we go. Or maybe those invoices. So then you could also pair it up with search results for the same one. Now I can actually see my search results in the e-form. Click on it to open it if I choose to, because I can turn that on in the new tab. Click it. Now I can do my work from an e-form. Let's expand this concept just a little bit further. Let's make a copy of this. We'll call this invoices. Call this one maybe HR or something. Okay. Now this, I don't know if I have an HR search, so let's go do one real quick. Do I have HR in this system? Personnel, anything, anyone? Oh, got personnel, here we go. I'll just take this, there. I'll just put the search ID in, but just type in that search ID. Maybe I'm not gonna chart this one. I go to my display properties, my form, and turn on tabs. Save. I'll just pop it out of here. Just showing off a little bit here. So there's your invoice dashboard, there's your HR dashboard. And you'll notice got our signatures over there. Probably would do is take off my maximum width for this form so I could see more data. So who needs this dashboard when you can give them your own?
And as far as the components of the chart, it's like it's based on a number and a date, correct?
Right. So let's say we want to do an invoices one. I'll just do a quick search to see what we have in the system. They don't have a whole lot here. So we've got from June to May or something like that. But what I do is go to the chart tab and say I want, let's do the amount. Let's just see the total amount of invoices. We'll graph that. We'll chart that. Or we can do a count if you want.
Yeah.
I'll do amount. We'll group them by invoice date. And we'll make this one a line chart. And we'll say invoices by amount / date. Do a search. There it is. So now what I typically would do is save this.
Right.
Just so I have it. And then in your eForm, when you take out this chart, for instance, we'll put in another chart. Now, I don't know if I'm going to have to refresh my screen. We'll see here. Invoices with chart. That's the first one I did, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there you go. So, but I'll refresh it here. I'll get the other one. Oh, shoot, did I save? I don't know if I saved. Anyway, there you go. Charted. That's the new one I just built. So the first thing you want to do is use the search engine. Use the search to build what you want. Because then you can come, instead of doing, I don't want to see all my invoices forever. I just want to see the ones that are coming up in the next month, let's say. So let's just say due date. Only show me the ones from today to maybe even the past 30 days to the next 30 days. Now, this won't find any because I think these are all back
right.
half a year ago. But so that's what you would do. And then anytime this search runs, it's going to be a rolling 60 days, past and forward 30 each way. And then every time that eForm runs, it does the same search, which means it's also going to be 30 days past to present, 60 days total. So that, and then you can even go so far as to say, let's say you have it limited by maybe the manager's name or some other department. You can actually code in the department variable too, so the same search runs differently for each department. And then you just share the one search. That one eForm works for everybody.
All about me, but so that where you have invoices and then you have HR on that eForm editor. How did you get to that tab again? Right.
So just make a page for each one.
Oh, okay.
You can set icons, and that's so this is invoices. Let's see, money. I'll do money. I like to put, and then on the form level, you go to display settings and turn on show pages as tabs. That's what we're going for because we've gotten a lot of requests for like adding a bunch of features to here and there and everywhere, but really they all came down to the same thing. They want to have dynamic displays, being able to put charts anywhere, stuff like that. And we already have this cool editor that allows you to do so much stuff. Let's just make the eForm our tool across the whole site. So when you share this eForm, you could just tell people, or you could do it for them, set them as their start page. And then when they log in, that's what they see. In this last release, we made several enhancements. So I just want to go through some of the changes. And I know some people haven't even seen these recently, so I'll go through probably most of the options actually. When you set up a portal, of course, you give it a name and all that. You can also now tell it what to open. So you could say, just show the list of, basically like the old portal view, show the list of all the things to do. That's the default. Or you can say, if there's only one item in the portal, just open it. So if you have a shared document and that's the only thing in the portal, it'll auto open. Because a lot of times if you're just sending a single thing out, it's just kind of a pain to tell them to click on the only item there. So this allows you to bypass that. Same thing with an eForm. If the eForm is the only thing there, auto open the eForm. Likewise, if you have one panel, let's say you're asking for 3 eForms, You can tell it just open up that panel to show the list of eForms. Otherwise, they default to everything collapsed, and then you have to open up the list of eForms. So we're just trying to make it simpler to get right to what you want people to do. If it's a single-use thing, I always say just auto-open. It's the greatest. Autocomplete, this is a workflow option. If the portal has been generated by workflow and it's configured to participate in workflow, what that means is when the user comes in and opens the portal that was generated from that workflow step, they will see the workflow buttons in the portal, right? And then when they're done filling out the 2 eForms and uploading a document or 2, whatever, they have to then go to the main screen of the portal and click the workflow button, one of them. If all you're doing is asking them to upload a single document, you could probably assume that you can autocomplete it, okay? So when they upload that document, boom, it automatically completes it, sends it through, and workflow's done. Same thing with a single eForm. I would say, though, if you're going to use an eForm, make sure the eForm is configured with everything required so they can't save it until they've finished it. Otherwise, you're going to trigger the internal workflow when they're maybe halfway done with the form. So you just want to make sure that you configure the form to make sure they fill everything out.
You ever considered like a save for later on the portal so that if there are required, they don't have to click the save button and it moves over to the completed section? And
that actually the save for later option is there too. If you look at and it works the same thing with kind of the offline. They kind of put the 2 things together. You can actually do a save for later. You know what? I'll have to test the portal. I apologize. The save for later was built for just public eForms. So let's say that, and I'm sorry to jump back to eForms, but let's go ahead and talk about it real quick. If you have an eForm configured as public, and I think if I turn public on, there we go, and go to your buttons, or you can use a custom button. There's actually a save for later button. If you tell them to click that, it does the same thing, same technology as our offline eForms. They can fill out half the form, hit save for later, close their browsers, come back a week later, go back to the same URL that they initiated it from your home page, and it'll load their last form up for them automatically. It should also work in a portal. I just haven't tested it, I'll be honest with you. So if you allow them to save for later, it doesn't do any of the data type checking. It doesn't submit the form. It just takes whatever they've got, saves it for later. And when they come back, then when they hit the actual save button, that's when all the required fields are checked. Likewise, in version 3, if you remember, when you would try to go from page 1 to page 2, if you had a required field on page 1 that wasn't filled out, it would stop you. In version 4, we don't do that till the very end now. So you can have a 5-page form. They could skip required fields, get all the way to the end and go, I'll save it for later. And it doesn't check any of those until they do the final save. So I think we're trying to, once again, just make it a little simpler for people, not force them to do so much, give them more options. Security, let's just go back to portals here. The default is to force them to put an email and a password in, which is the most secure. But you can also then say, you can change it to password only or even no security. So if you have something that is really not security sensitive, go ahead and do no security. But you got to make sure you're not asking for anything like name, address, phone number, because that personal information is pretty picky nowadays. So at least password only in those cases. If you think about it, if you just want simple, no security, auto open, auto complete, you got 1 eForm in it, boom, 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 done, they saved, you're out. That's it. And then to kind of round that out, on the instructions side, you can put, all this stuff about, please fill out this form, whatever, here's all the instructions, 1, 2, 3, all this big, long, verbose stuff. And then in the footer, you can say copyright 2023, whatever, legal. But then we have another section we just added, which is the completed instructions. So once the portal gets completed, you can put a big old, please click the workflow button. All right, and you can make that a heading 1, centered, red, all sorts of stuff. So that shows up instead of this after it's completed. So while they're working it, this shows up before and during, and then when they're done, it comes back to a screen. Now you have a custom screen. If you don't put anything in here, then this will keep showing like it does today. But if you put something in here, this will be shown instead.
Nice. And then, of course, if you do autocomplete, you don't have to have a completion instructions because it autocompletes. Yeah.
Yeah, you could just say, please close your browser or something like that.
Thank you. Please close your browser. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Email settings, I don't think those have changed much at all. In fact, I know they haven't. Okay, required documents. One thing I did do, if you've ever used the old portal editor and the version 4, everything popped up in little panels. It got really ugly. So now we're doing everything with kind of little pop-up boxes. It's so much simpler. Talk about those in a second. So the required documents haven't changed much. The shared documents haven't changed either. You just tell it what documents in here to share. So maybe if you only want to show the invoices, you would say show everything in the invoice category. And you could do things such as putting in variables for the description, something like that, and it'll put the invoice date in here. So you can customize that description a little bit that shows up on the panel, but then here's what it actually uses to show which category, which documents. On the required e-forms, let's go ahead and put a couple over there. A couple things we've done here. You can give it a custom title now in the panel. So instead of saying e-form list, you could put in a list of forms for you to fill out before we'll do any work for you, or something like that. So you can make it very specific to the case. Because there are times when form list just doesn't make sense, you know, something that's bland like that. So you can customize the titles on all these too. Dynamically adjust the portal completion. So that's where, you know, like Brock was saying, if you have a form already in the record that matches the one that the portal needs, if you have this option turned on, it automatically checks that off the list as saying it's been completed. If you don't like that, you can turn that off, and they specifically have to go into the portal to create that form for it to be checked off. We don't look at what's in the form. We just look at what they've done in the form, in the portal. Typically on is the way you want it. Now this one I am especially fond of. Progress from e-form to e-form. So you have a process where you've got 20 pages of forms to fill out. The customer comes to you and says, I want a form that they fill out to enter all this information out. And you go, can we break it up? No, one form. Okay, great. So you start breaking it out by page, page to page to page. And the darn thing is just so big, it just takes too long to load. It's hard for you to keep everything straight because it's a huge form. Well, now you can break it up into 20 individual e-forms in the system and show them the list of e-forms if you want to. But you can also, and I'll show you here in a second, you can auto open the first one for them. But when they do complete the first form, it'll automatically go to the second form, then to the third, then to the fourth. Then let's say they get done to 4 and they just close their browser. They come back later, it's automatically saved the first 4. Now they'll go to the 5th one to get started again, and so on and so on. So now you can make 20 forms feel like one form that's just different pages. You've broken up all the work so you can have 10 or 20 different people on your staff create individual forms. And it's not one huge, big monolithic thing that you have to hit save for later on every time, and it sits and spins for a minute because it's such a big form. So anyway, it makes it simpler to manage. We actually just got done with a project like that, and I think it was 7 forms. And they loved it. Just you turn that on and just walk them step to step. It's great.
Yeah, I've got a portal with 10 forms for HR, and
there you go.
The password only is a godsend, and the progress from e-form to e-form and autocomplete, that's a game changer.
Yeah, I like that one. That actually that'll help a lot. When you need it, it's going to be invaluable. I don't think anything else has really changed much lately, but you can specify what record types the portal is associated with. Custom actions, if nobody's used those, it's just like the e-form custom actions, the automation. As the user logs in, you can trigger an action set. So you can get emailed, hey, that user came in. Document uploading, hey, send an email saying somebody just uploaded a document. Or maybe when the document's uploaded every time, you want to do a check to see if the required documents are met, some kind of thing like that. In fact, on that one form portal that I was just talking about with 8 forms, on the next to last form, I think it was, the customer said, really the last page or the last 2 pages, whichever, are optional. We don't care about them, but if they fill it out, we want to keep them. So what we did was we actually automatically triggered workflow action on the 6th form after they completed it, not through this exactly, but actually through the e-form itself, but it's the same concept. And then so that the other 2 forms were just extra and basically the internal users could start working them while the end users are still filling out the other forms. But the same concept. And then every time an e-form is completed, you could trigger an action. So if you haven't looked at those those are just nice ways to get notifications. People are coming in. And that's why we added it for, really, is for notification, to let people know people are using the portals. Because you could go back to the record and you can update the last opened flag, when they done the login. So the last, every time they've come in, add a record note that said the customer came in and logged in, that kind of thing. All sorts of fun stuff. So this is where you would set up the portal template. Then, of course, inside the record, the portals will be created either automatically or whatever. If you haven't needed them, some of that might have kind of gone over your head, but just to take a square one approach at it, collaboration portals are used to share information to outside users. What you do is you basically have a portal that points to a record. And when they come to that portal, they can share out of that record whatever you want to show them, documents, e-forms, whatever. You can request that they fill out e-forms, request that they upload documents. But now, when we first started this, the e-forms were not very dynamic. So really, all the portals I'm building now are almost always just e-forms. I don't think I've made a non-e-form portal, one that has document uploaders and document sharing, because you can do all that in e-form now. So I would definitely stress just use the e-forms. It simplifies everything. Looping and workflow was one that comes up a lot. What I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate some of it in the actual add-ins, but the same concept works in workflow, because add-ins and workflow are exactly the same. The only difference is with workflow, you're following a path to go to a certain place to do things, whereas with an add-in, you're clicking a button, but they all perform actions the same way. So let's talk about looping. Once again, looping is enterprise only, so if you have a standard edition, you won't be able to use any of this stuff almost all the time, unless you're doing a simple search and retrieve. Something comes up where you need to loop through the documents to do something, loop through the line items and do something, loop through records, do something. There's just loops come up all the time in simplest little ways. All right, so let's talk about looping. So I'll just put in a loop test add-in. I will show this within the top toolbar. And I'm going to say an action. Let's talk about loops. Let's see here. So if you type in the word loop in your action type dropdown, you'll see a series of them, action loop. What that means is it's going to loop however many times you tell it and perform whatever actions are inside the loop over and over again. So cases of this might be to loop through a list of documents, or maybe you split, maybe you have to David's application, one field holds a list of purchase orders separated by semicolon. You split that, and for every element of that, you loop. Fairly common when you're doing data processing, data comparison, like I said, PO lookups on this case. But yeah, David actually had an example where the PO numbers were multiple, and he split on them, and for each one, he'd go do a lookup in the PO record type to find matches. It got a lot more complicated than that, but that's the simple explanation, right, Dave?
Yeah.
So let's look at a simple example, kind of like what we were just talking about. I'm going to, now let's see, we don't have a record here, so I'm just going to do a generic one. I'm just going to tell it to loop 5 times. Okay, so, and you'll notice that this has a little enterprise logo on it, means it's enterprise only. You just tell it how many times to loop. Usually you don't have a static number here. Usually you would have some kind of a variable, like maybe line item count, tells you the number of line items in the record, loops for each one. That would be in a good example. Or in Dave's case, the split of, and I think actually the num-ls is the one that we wanted, but anyway, basically something along the lines of split PO number by semicolon, that kind of thing, and then you do a count on that. And we'll get into the variable stuff a little later, but basically what I'm doing here is I'm splitting that field by semicolons, I think, and then that'll return back a list of semicolon delimited, and then the count around it will tell you how many there were in it. Okay. In this case, I'm going to go simple. I'm going to say 5. Now, I'm just going to do these actions 5 times. Now, what can I do? I don't have any records right now because I'm clicking it from a toolbar. And that's the important context thing. We talk about context all the time. If you do an add-in from the toolbar, you don't have a record in context. There is no record available. Because even though you're looking at a record behind the screens, the toolbar is not focused on what you're looking at. It's just focused on the toolbar, which is more environmental. Okay, so you can get to things like username, user ID, my email address, I can get all that stuff, but I can't see a specific record that's loaded in front of me. If you want that, you would make an add-in at the record level. Okay, you can have a button up here. Then it would see the record, but up here you don't. So with that in mind, you can't really use the direct record ones, but I could say create a record. So maybe I'll create a new one. Create record. There we go. So I'm going to create 5 new records. Each time I loop, it's going to make a new one. Okay. So I'm going to say record number. I'll just make one field. I'll call it record number. So every time it loops, that the counter, which is called the loop action counter, every time this runs through a loop, this variable becomes available with the number the loop is in. So the first time it'll be a 1, next loop it'll be a 2, so on up to 5, and then it's done. So I'm going to take that and say, all right, I'm going to create a new record. All it's going to have is a record number field, and it's going to have that number in it. Okay, that's all I'm going to do. I'm just going to create the record, do it 5 times, done. So let's just save that. Refresh my add-ins. All right, loop test. Okay, first of all, I'm going to look and see if I have a record number field. I don't believe I do. All right, just one more check to make sure. I'm going to do a custom field each search by record number is not blank. Nothing. Okay, perfect. Now, if I run that loop test, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, did it happen that fast? Sure did. I just created 5 records by clicking that button. Now, if I do it again, it'll run 5 more times, and it'll start over at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'll leave that open. Let's go back into the add-in editor. So in its simplest form, the loop test just does a loop and does what you tell it X number of times, in this case, 5. I just told it to create 5 records. I ran it twice. You could also specify when the record's created to route it. There's all sorts of things the actions will do, but let's just focus on the loops themselves. All right, so I could do emails. I could do 5 emails, all that kind of thing. So the loop, the action loop is kind of your general purpose tool. If you just got a loop on something, like something that's in your data, like I said, kind of that count variable thing, this is the way to go usually. But a lot of times loops are very much more specific. So you might want to loop through documents and do something. Okay, so let's say you're in a record and then want to give the person a button that loops through the documents, and for each one, it renames them. Let's do that. So I'm going to say look for the category, let's just say doc, okay? And for each document that's in the doc category, and it's going to ignore these, it's going to grab everything, no matter what subcategory name, do these actions. Okay, so for every document I find, maybe I can do set document properties or something like that. So maybe I change the document to another category or something like that. There could be all sorts of things I could do. I could convert it to a PDF maybe. So what you do inside the loop is up to you, but what happens is every document it finds, it's going to do these actions on each one of them. Now, it actually sends a reference of the document into the action. So if you have document level actions, let's see, merge data into document, there's all sorts of things. You create document zips, apply annotations. You could say, it's going to say, okay, take the active document, which is the one it's looping through, whichever one it found, and then apply this annotation to it. On page 1, make a line from here, from this point to that point, 1, 1 to 0 to 100, 100. Maybe let's make it red, that kind of thing. So now it'll loop through every document that matches, and it'll put a line on it. And as an annotation only, it won't actually burn it in unless you tell it to, which you can do. So let's just go ahead and put that in there now. What we're looking through is doc. So now I'm going to change this add-in to be a record level add-in in the invoices record type. And it's going to loop through every document in the doc category and put an annotation on it. So let's go to our invoices. I don't have a lot in here, but I'll move one over to doc. Okay, let's just edit that. Doc. I'm going to put another one in there just for good measure. Invoices, Bob's Burger Joint. I love that one. Okay, so we got a couple in there now. If I go to my add-in list, Should be a loop test. Here's my line on both documents. So it's just doing what I told it. Go to every document in the doc category and put an annotation on it. Another kind of loop we use a lot is a line item loop. This will loop through every line item in the record, which I believe this one has line items. Let me look here. Oh, I'm looking at the chart. Even better. Let me change that real quick. Get back to default here. Entry screen standards. Okay. There we go. So maybe I want to double the quantity on every line item. Who doesn't, right? Let me look at the field names, make sure I know the field names. Well, actually, I can choose it in the add-in. Never mind. So I'm going to do a data value update. I'm going to set the, let's do the amount, did I say, or which one did I want to do? The quantity. Let's do quantity. Take quantity for the line item I'm in. Now, this is the key. I need to tell it which line to update. If I just go, quantity times 2 or whatever, which this is a shorthand version of it, it'll do it at the header level. I need to tell it what line number. Well, what line number am I on in my loop? Line counter. So I can just use that and say, okay, for each line, update its quantity times 2. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. If I just put in here, give me the quantity, once again, it's going to look at the header. It's not going to look at the line item. You have to tell it to go to the line items by using the li variable, line item variable. Okay, so line item, line number 1, take the quantity value and put that in the quantity field of line number 1. That's not going to do anything. It's the same thing. So what I'll do is a math statement around it. Math, take that times 2. So it'll grab the value in the quantity for this line item, and it'll multiply it times 2 by using the math function. Okay, and it loops through each one. You got line counter that comes from up here, and then of course you use your variables to pull. All right, so let's go back to the record. Add in. Okay, so we have 450 and 125. Don't forget that. 450 and 125. There you go. 900 and 250. If I run it again, of course, it should be 1800 and 500. My math is right. There you go. So we're just looping through the line items and doing stuff. Now, in this case, I happen to also update the line items, but you don't always have to do that. For instance, pulling against Dave's use case again, what he was doing is on every line item in an invoice, there was a PO number field in the line item. He would do a search in the PO record type by the line item for that field, find a match in another record type, make sure it's still available, that number of elements is available or whatever, and it can then pull back and update the invoices line items with the data count in the PO. And more than that, but that's the simple version. So you don't have to operate on the line item. It's just for every line item, it's going to do something. I could just as easily have done that, create record thing. And I don't know why I would do that. Oh, I do know why I do that. I just did that the other day. We have an application. This is another application of this, but in this, for one customer's request, they have an application record type. And these parents would apply their students to school or would apply for the school. They go through the application process, and we stored all the children's names that they were entering into the forms into the line item fields. And after they saved it and that form got routed, one of the workflow steps was to loop through all those children's line items and create records in another record type called the children record type, students record type, really. So now we have an application. We created the records on the students for them automatically, already put the linked, we have the record types linked by the application ID. So now they're related and linked together. So that was one other reason for the line item looping, was to create other records. Let's do another loop here just to see what else we have.
Can you do a
Table
document
row
count?
loop.
Can you do a document count loop?
Yes.
Or is that a thing you can do? Okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you just do the regular loop. That's where your Swiss Army knife comes in. And then you would do, I think it's DocCount. And then you tell it the record ID and the category and the name and all that stuff. and it'll return back the number of documents. And if
Okay,
you're
'cause
doing it on
that's-
the current record ID, you could just do like this, I think.
That's a use case I think I'm gonna hit you up for later someday.
Well, there's also the document loop that you can loop through. You don't need to do the count if you already can loop the documents, possibly.
Right.
But if it didn't work for whatever reason, then you can do the doc loop. We have table row loop. So, okay, so now you have an eForm with a table on it, but you're not saving that table to the line item data. Now, if at all possible, I prefer to save tables to line items because they're easier to manipulate, they're easy to access. But you can't save 20 different tables into one line item set, right? It doesn't work. So sometimes you have line items or data that's just in the table in an eForm. So what you can do is you can say, okay, this table was saved a record and we named it children, and it's in this record ID. But if you leave it blank, it just means the active record that's getting routed, or for an add-in, it's the record you're in when you click the button. So you don't always have to supply this. So it'll find a table named children and it'll loop through it. Okay, so for each one of them, do these actions. Similar to before, instead of having a line counter or whatever, now you have a row counter. So you get a row counter variable. And then to get the data out of the rows, you can say, okay, I want to do an update. Maybe what I want to do is loop through this table and pull the total out, right? So I can say for each one, update the header total equal to math total. That pulls the header, and then add to it row colon. Maybe there's maybe it's a amount, right? That would be pretty common. There. So what it would do is say, okay, grab the total that's already in there, and if it's empty, that means it's going to be a 0, and add to it this row's amount value. The next time, do the same thing. Now we have a total with 100, and we're going to add another 20 to it. So now you get 120. The next time it loops, it adds another 50 to it. It's 170. So you're just accumulating that total by looping. And by the time you're done, this total field will have the total of all the fields in that column called amount. Then at the end of the loop, you could probably then do an average, which would be math of total. This is simplified, divided by, and then here you could do like, there's actually a table row count variable you can use to pass in, so you could get the same thing. So you can do all sorts of stuff with it. But anyway, just to show that you loop through a table. Now, if that table was not saved to record, if it was saved to document, then you'd have to tell it where the document is, either by ID or by specifying the one that's in this category, that kind of thing. Or if you're routing the eForm, it'll be the active document. So you can leave it all blank. That's another reason for whether you route an eForm or you don't route an eForm. If you're not routing the eForm itself, but you tell it to just route the record, then you won't have the eForm document in context in workflow. It'll just see the record and you're going to have to go find the document. If you have the eForm being routed, then all these types of actions will see the document automatically. You don't have to tell it where it is because it's already in context. Okay, so all the loops really work the same. It's just what they're looping through that's different. So there's another one. The last one is the CSV document loop. Now, I would recommend not doing this on a 10,000 row CSV file because it'll time out the browser. Depending on what actions you're doing, it'll just take too long to run. And that's with any of these things, especially if you're doing an add-in button. If you do a big, long process that takes 5 minutes, the browser's not going to wait that long. The end user is going to get an error message that pops up, and they're going to call you every day, and why is this thing breaking? Well, it's not breaking, it's just timing out. So you have a CSV, you tell it, where are the CSVs? Where is the CSV, excuse me, what category, subcategory, name? And then you perform actions. And in this case, you use CSV column name instead of row column name. So I'd say go to the amount column in this row, this line, CSV line, technically. And you can do the exact same thing. I can total up the CSV by using this syntax. Same thing as I could with our own tables. And then you have line counter here instead of row counter. So you theoretically could create an eForm that allowed them to upload a list of users. And then you would take that, break down the CSV, and you could do this create user, add new user. And for each CSV column, you could say set the username equal to username, password equal to the password column, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same concept that for every row of the CSV, you can do things. And one of them might be to import users. You could use it to create records. You could use it to update records. You know, do a search on this column's value for PO number and go update the PO values over here. Now, I would probably recommend using importer instead. But what if the customer is an all Mac shop, Macintosh shop? Importer won't run on a Mac. They have no Windows machines at all. Well, okay, set up an add-in button they click, or they have an e-form, they upload it through there and have the system do it instead of importer. The reason why I prefer importer is the logging is better. You can see problems better. But this could be a quick and dirty way of doing it too. That is the last looping action. Once you know one of them, it's just a matter of applying the same logic to the other ones, just looking at different variables depending on whether it's CSV or table or whatever. And I would recommend playing with this. Make an add-in button for yourself that loops through a CSV that's in the current record, you know, things like that. Just play with it and see what happens. You'll come up with questions, of course, but a lot of things you can do. Here's one big old caveat to the looping that David already knows and a couple of you already know. If you start doing loops inside of loops inside of loops inside of loops, so let's say you have a loop action that loops through every document, and for every document, it loops through all the line items to see if the line item matches, and for every line item it finds, it loops through all the data elements with a certain name, and for every one of those, it does another loop that creates records on every one it finds. Every time you embed a loop inside of a loop, causes what we call recursion. Every time a loop starts, it goes back to the top of the, I'm getting technical here, but basically the top of the stack, and starts executing actions again. And then when that loop is done, it comes back to the other stack and runs its actions. If you have stack over stack over stack over stack, eventually you'll get what we call a stack overflow error. We've tested, and it seems like it can go about 4 to 5 levels deep in your loops before we get that. Most programming languages have that as a fail-safe so that you don't have functions that call themselves over and over again and get in an infinite loop. And they'll eventually just go, nope, stop. It looks like an infinite loop. We're not going to let you do anymore. And it just literally stops everything. We can't log any errors. We can't see it happening. You just get this big, ugly red box that pops up and you don't know what happened. When you get into the point where you're doing loops inside of loops inside of loops, be careful because, like I said, you can go 4 levels deep, and that would be about it probably. It doesn't come up often, but occasionally. All right. So now can you all understand why looping is an enterprise feature? And supporting it is a lot more because I have to ask questions sometimes on looping because it's that hard to keep your head wrapped around it, especially when you look at how you do looping with search and updates and stuff like that. Because if you're looping through multiple records, let's say, or multiple documents, and you're doing something where you're doing a search in another record type, you now have 2 records in memory. You have the record you started from and the record that you found when you did the search. That's called the alternate record. And you can actually access both of them with variables, and you can update both of them with all the update actions. So, for instance, if we look at, just throw an action in here, it doesn't matter, I guess. If I do an update, set total equal to 100, right? If I'm in a workflow context where I have a record in front of me, it's going to update that record. Okay, no big deal. It's going to set total to 100. But we have in the options the alternate record flag. If I started with record A, and then I went out and did a search and found record B, inside that loop that found record B is now, can technically be the active record, and the one I started from will be the alternate. If I do a search and run actions, there we go, search and run actions, and I think I might have just said it backwards. If I do a search from here, and I do some actions on everything I find in another record type, let's say, the one I came from is the active record, and the ones that I found are the alternate records. But when I'm executing actions inside those alternate records, the alternate records become the active records. So if I find a purchase order based on this search, okay, let's say I search for purchase orders. Do I have any? Yes, perfect. I find purchase orders and I run some actions. If I say put total equal to 100, I'm going to be updating the purchase order record that I found. Not the one I came from, but the one I found. unless I switch this option to say update the alternate. Now I can say, now update my invoice total. It goes back to the alternate record. So it gets really confusing, and you have to really kind of storyboard things out, either mentally or on paper, to keep track of what you're looking at. So it definitely gets tricky. So when you get into those, let me know. We can work through them. Variables. You've already seen me do some things in the actions where I'm using brackets and stuff like that. And I think most of you know this, but if I use a bracketed value, it's going to look at the currently active record or the environment and try to find a variable that matches it. So for instance, date time will not find a variable in a record. It's going to look for the date and time of the server. Okay, so I'm going to go do this handy dandy variable testing. And if you haven't used this, by all means, get used to it. Under admin variable testing, I can put that date time variable in and hit run it, and it'll tell me what's going to come back. Okay, so I could do a whole like date time. I was here at or on whatever, doing nothing. Right, run that. What it does is just replaces everything between the brackets with whatever value it finds. Okay, so now if I go to a record. Okay, so here's a record. Let me go to the raw data. I'll just pick one here. Amount. Okay, so if I go to the variable tester and I try to do this amount, it's going to come back with nothing because the variable tester doesn't see the record behind the scenes. It's just running from the toolbar. So if you want to test it against a record, take the record ID up here, go to the test data tab and say, operate on this record for everything from now on. Now when I run it, it returns back the amount from that record, looking at that record ID. So now I can get fun and say, and I could do some math stuff. So here's where that math thing comes in again. Times 2, whatever, run it. And actually I'll do 2 of them back to back. One with the original amount, and one that returns times 2. Okay. Notice that it doesn't care about the dollar signs. We help you with that a little bit. So this is a great tool for just testing what the variables do, but the variables will look, like I said, you can look at variables that are in the environment that are not record specific, like date, time, username. That'll return my username, who I'm logged in as. There's my date and time, there's my amount. That one came from a record. The way it happens is the variable engine will first look at the environment. Do I have an environment variable with that name? If I do, I'll return that. If I don't, do I have a record in memory, in context? If I do, I'll look at that record to see if I find a value. If I do, I'll return that. If it doesn't, then if you have a document in context, it can also look at document variables, which are a thing, but they're not very common. But you can use document variables too. If you have somebody, and let's just do this, this happens all the time. There's a date, right? So we got the date, got the date time, and we got my username. How many times have you guys had somebody, or you have set up a record type where you use the word date for the invoice date? It happens, okay? If you run into that, you can also tell the system to not look at the environment variables. If you wrap it in a parentheses, like that, then it'll just look for the record. It'll skip the environment check. Okay? There was no date variable in this one, so it came back blank. So if you absolutely have to use, or somebody's already put in a reserved name, date, time, username, stuff like that, you can still get to the record value by wrapping it in parentheses. So not total loss cause. All right, that's pulling data. That's great. There's so much more than you can do with this stuff. And what I try to tell people is the Shift F1 takes you right to the variable replacement help section. And there's a ton of stuff in here. So it goes through all the basics. What day is it? What day was it on this date? You can look at a variable like due date inside and tell what date it was. You can do adding of dates. There's all sorts of stuff in here. If you want to do date manipulation, go to the date variable section. There's just a whole section of just date stuff. Date difference, you can calculate the difference between two dates, even using business days if you need to. Formatting dates, cleaning dates. Same thing with numbers. If you have numeric, there's your ifs, there's your formats. Is number, there's also an is date variable. The difference between two numbers, absolute and rounding, minimum, maximum, counting, averaging, summing, all that stuff.
Is there a time math on that? So I clocked in at 8 a.m. I clocked out at 4:45 p.m. Is that there? Okay.
Yeah, in the diff command, it handles numeric and dates, and you can tell it to do. Here's right here. And you can use your period of months, minutes, hours, seconds. So you can calculate it based on minutes and then divide by 60 to get how many hours, that kind of thing.
Okay.
If you go across days, you can, like, if you're doing weeks and months, you could do like end of data week, start of data week, so you can say how many weeks it was, things like that. So it gets a little tricky, but usually you would just do the first 2 or 3. That's about it.
Yeah, the only thing with the difference that I would like to see, I've used it where we're trying to get like the number of hours that have been worked. It only will round that number, I believe. I don't think it can go to a decimal place at all.
Let's see. If you do like for minutes, yeah, it probably goes down to the minute. So let's do date time. The difference between that and on 1, 2, well, let's not go that far. What is it? 2:15. So I'll go 2/14/2023 at 11 p.m. Zeros, not O's. I think the lowercase m. That's why I always have to check myself. Yeah, lowercase m per minute. Okay. So there's 941 different. I should have put them on the opposite way. But by this, well, I guess down to the minute. Were you looking at like hours?
Yeah,
Fractions of hours?
to the hour.
Okay,
Yep.
let's do that. Okay, so let's look at, and I know that should be a fraction. Yep. So what I would probably do is go with minute, and I think if you do a math, divide by 60. I haven't tested this, so let me reverse these so we get a positive number. There you go. I could have used absolute on it. There you go, 15.7.
There you go.
Yeah, so when you, and the reason why it does that is because the way .NET does it, we're actually leveraging them all the way through the system, of course. When you say hours, it just gives you hours. Good question, appreciate that.
Yeah.
But there's just so many things in here. A lot of them just return values. They manipulate values, return back, splitting, joining, that kind of stuff. But let's talk about some more of the ones. Okay, so just to your case, David, you wanted to look at the doc count. So here's doc count. What documents do I have? I have doc. Okay, so I'm going to go and do a variable testing. Doc count of the record ID I'm in. So I'll just do record ID. I have that coded in. Now, record ID is one of those variables that are reserved. If you're in a record, that'll return the ID number of the record, and you do use that a lot. Okay, which category? I think it was just doc, right? And it's not case sensitive, most of this stuff. And I don't care about the name of the subcat. So there you go. But there's just so many uses for these. It's almost hard to just give someone a training session on these because the use cases are so varied. So just to go through them, there's some of them that only work in certain contexts. Okay, so like if I actually use the delete variable inside of an add-in, let's say when I click the button per record here, I'll say take this variable and I want to delete it. I can just use the delete. And what that does is it'll actually literally delete the whole record type value and the actual data element from the record. Whereas if I went like this, it would just turn it to a blank. So there are times when I like to delete versus set to nothing. So that's what the delete one does. You can get the server URL. Now this is handy if you're going to send an email out to someone that says, hey, click this link to look at this record, that kind of thing. You could, come on, there you go. Send an email out, and in the body of the email, you could say, click this link. Jeez. And it would be server URL v4/record/12345. Or if you're in the record, just use the record ID variable. And that will resolve to the whole URL up here with v4 record, whatever. And so server URLs, I use that quite a bit in some of my automated notifications, things like that. Server version, which you probably wouldn't use, but I use it occasionally. GUID will actually create a unique number for you based on a GUID scheme. It's like a 24-character GUID. So if you ever needed a truly globally unique identifier, that's guaranteed to be 1 in 20 billion or something like that, unique. So if you needed something, you could use that. Branding, this is something a lot of people don't realize, but you can actually get to the branding colors that people have defined for like their background. So let's say the headers, background colors. Oh, gotta wrap it. There we go. Okay. That's the hex code that is this blue. So if you ever needed to use this in an eForm, you could set the background color on eForm's header or something like that using this variable. And then if the customer decided to change their color scheme, you wouldn't have to change your eForms to match. You would just use whatever they specified. Like I said, a lot of people don't know about these. You can get the banner URL, the toolbar icon. So if they have a toolbar icon up here that they've put custom, you can get the URL to that. So you can use it in your eForms. Once again, if they decide to change their branding and replace their image, your eForm would just automatically update with their new image. These only happen in bait stamping. So like I say, some of these in the miscellaneous are kind of varied on where you can use them. Requester, that's something that comes up a lot of times in forms. People will try to use the requester variable and it always comes back blank. If you use a name requester in one of your forms, fields, whatever, use the parentheses around it because we use that for asset tracking. So whoever requests the asset tracking, their name and their email. So if you ever get into asset tracking stuff, you've got a few variables here. I'm not going to go through all these, but to use them as just bracket, name, bracket, and if they have any parameters, you just put them in parentheses. And they work inside out. That's the important thing to remember. So like that math example we were doing, math, and then I'll just do, I think day returns back a number of the day. Let me check on that. 15, okay. So 15 is the day of the, oh yeah, it's the day of the month, 15. So if I want to take the day of the month and multiply that times 2, right? If you look at it, the only way this works is because it starts on the beginning. It goes, the first thing it does is make a pass to find the innermost variable, which is this. And it replaces that with whatever the value is. So it replaces this with 15. Then it looks for the next outer variable, which is this whole thing. And then it does that replacement, comes back with 30. So if you need something to happen, like in this case, you got to think from the inside out. Get the day first, then multiply that times 2 in the math. Because really, at the end of the day, it's just doing replacement, string replacement. It's going to replace this string with whatever comes back. And it replaces this. So I've had some that are, 10 levels deep. And we actually used to have a recursion error with that too, kind of like the looping. But we don't have that anymore. We've addressed that. So you can put 30 or 40 of them embedded into them if you want to, but boy, that gets ugly. And I've worked on some. They're tough. All right, record variables, you can get the date changed, date created, all this, a lot of the stuff that you see in the interface, you can actually get to yourself. You can see how many, like for instance, let's say, David, that PO number you have in one field called, and it's delimited by semicolons or whatever. Mm-hmm. If you used a multi field on that one where you could actually add 3 purchase order numbers, you could do this and tell you how many purchase orders there were. Okay. And then you could actually take this and okay, give me the first one, field PO number 1, PO number 2. So you could do it that way as well. But if you have, with yours, you would just do a string manipulation and do a split on it. Split PO number by semicolon. It all works the same. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Right. You can get the record notes. If you want to see the notes, the last 10 notes, you could say the record ID 10 there, separate them by a line feed character or a colon or something. So you could actually return back in an eForm the last 10 notes from a record. And if you're thinking about your dashboard, you could actually find other records to pull back from. So I could go to 10 different records and pull all the notes from all 10 of them and put them in one form if you wanted to. Form values, kind of like we did in the workflow, give me the form data. And this one you won't use much because this comes from those general forms, machine learning stuff. You could say, just grab me from this area of the screen, any field with the name that. But I would just recommend going through these. You don't have to memorize them, but just kind of familiarize yourself with the types of things that are available. You can actually get annotations, references to annotations, and then user stuff. Anything about the user, A lot of stuff is available. Their addresses, their phone numbers, whatever you've got to put into our admin screens, you can get to pretty much. Okay? You can see if a user's in a team. If so, return this value. If not, return that value. And if you want to look at somebody else, you can put their username. Otherwise, it'll look at the current user if you just do these three. But these are fun to play with. These are new, out of office. And we haven't talked about this one much, but we've been enhancing the out of office features. So you can set myself out of office, and I could say that maybe I'll make the agent my backup user. If I set this, I can actually get back. Well, let me save it. I can get back what the out of office status is of the person. Now I'm just going to get rid of the username, so it'll return for the current user. Okay, this is the entire object of the user that is my alternate. So if you needed to get the email address of that person, that kind of thing, it's going to be in here. It's the ID number 2, user ID 2, or username doc management agent. So let's say in workflow, you need to send a reminder to somebody. You could check to see if they're out of office, and if they are, send it to the other person instead. And having the ability for people to set their out of office here is nice. If you notice when I did that, this out of office flag turned on. So if I come back in next week, I go, oh yeah, I'm out of office. If I click on it, I can go, yeah, fine, I'm back. Workflow variables. Once again, this stuff is all available in the workflow context and only inside of a workflow context. So if I tried to do one of these just against a record, it would come back empty because there's no workflow. I would actually have to be in the workflow engine, in those button clicks and the assignment actions. They're available. Outside of them, they're not. Just keep that in mind. Date variables, kind of the same thing. You can get years, months, dates. I like getting the month start, month end. I use that a lot, where just find me the first and last day of this month so I could do range searches easier. Just all sorts of stuff in there. You can check to see if something is a date. If so, return it. Otherwise, return something else, that kind of stuff. Differences we already talked about. Numbers. If one is tricky, I'll run through one example of that. We got a couple minutes left because it's a lot of things shoved into one. So if 1 is greater than 2, then say yes, otherwise say no. Now 1 is not greater than 2, so it's going to say no. But if I said, well, if it's less than, then say yes. So this will be whatever returns back if it's true, and this is whether it's false. So I could then say, okay, if it's true, return the date time. Otherwise, if it's not true, return, I don't know, username. Weird, you know. Now, if I make it greater than, it's not, so it should return my username. So that's how you can do checks for if this value is greater than X, then do this, otherwise that.